Hello, everyone. This is Vikram Prakash, and you are listening to Architecture Talk. We continue to have our conversations with amazing and interesting people designed to expand the frontier of architectural thinking. I'm still on my travels through Europe with my son. From Venice, we came to Rotterdam and Amsterdam, and then we were in Paris for 5 days, where we had an incredible time, including a fantastic visit to the Villa La Roche and the Fondation Le Corbusier. And from there, we took the Channel, the Eurostar, into London, where I am now. This is where I'm recording this introduction to this next episode, which is with my great friend, Phillip Thurtle, who is professor here at the University of Washington and who is the director of the Comparative History of Ideas program, and who is a fantastic scholar of the exceptional and the strange, I would say. I'm having a conversation about the Gothic. I'm talking to him about what that is and why he privileges it as a site of inquiry, particularly from his vantage as a historian of biology, as a historian of science. He has a unique perspective linking Immanuel Kant and the music of the 1970s band The Cure together into a fascinating and Gothic bundle. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Here we go. I'll be back in Seattle next week.
Architecture is really the art and science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hi, Phil. Welcome to Architecture Talk. It's such a pleasure to have this conversation with you here today. You and I have been on this committee for the last 6 months or so, on Amrita Vinod's committee, and she just presented yesterday.
Yes.
Fabulous presentation. So congratulations on your guidance and support on this committee. And I'm deeply grateful to Amrita for having, in this sense, we knew of sort of each other, but having the opportunity to consistently work together.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me on this. It's been a joy working with you, and I look forward to not just this conversation, but many more conversations in the future.
But looking forward to that. I think that in many ways I feel we have much in common, and I've been so delighted to read this recent paper from June 2020, published in this journal that I had never heard of, which sounds fantastic, called the Angelaki, the Journal of the Theoretical Humanities.
Yes, these exist.
Lovely. What a title.
Yeah.
Angelaki, Journal of Theoretical Humanities. And in here you have this article by Phillip Thurtle, Alienated Life Toward a Goth Theory of Biology. So already the title Goth and the beautiful curvilinear snake tattoo on your right arm.
Oh, that's right.
has me very interested. And if I may talk about, if I may crudely summarize this paper, it seems to me you are doing a certain, I would say in some ways, continuing the Foucauldian critique of normativity, particularly the critique of normal health. And at the baseline in this argument, in your paper, you are saying this whole idea about medical kind of bias or imperative towards health and life and forwardness, which that seeps into popular life as I'm life, being alive, and sort of all my cells being alive, is actually a profound fiction, and not only a profound fiction, but a normative and potentially destructive fiction, which is better replaced, I think this is what you're saying, with a more coeval or sort of co-goth understanding of life as the simultaneity of being alive and dying at the same time.
That's
at
right.
all times.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah, that's perfect. That's
yes.
wonderful.
Yes.
Are you sure you still need me for the interview?
No, of course I need you, because I think that's the baseline argument.
Yes.
I think there are a lot of other sort of...
That's very true as well.
Before we get into the sort of entanglements that come out of all of this, which you widely refer to in your paper. Can I start off by The Cure, 1970s and 80s, lovingly addressed in this paper, and amazing Goth-like simultaneity of reading Kant right next to The Cure is beautiful.
Yeah.
Why are you into the Gothic?
Fantastic. Yeah.
Where does this go back to?
It comes from a conjunction, not from my life, not going back to the 70s and 80s so much, but a conjunction with some of my dissatisfaction with the prevalence of systems theory thinking in biology.
Yeah.
And discussions I was having with my daughter
Oh.
about music from 80s and 90s that she was just discovering.
Okay.
And also dissatisfaction about how we craft arguments in the humanities and in the academy in general by appealing to critical thinkers.
Yeah.
And I wanted to kind of break that mold a little bit.
Okay, but why Goth then?
Well, for me, the interesting thing about Goth is, first of all, the type of aesthetics that it brings with it, and how that links up to a certain type of politics. And with the...
Which comes first for you, the aesthetics or the politics? For me, it's the aesthetics.
Yeah. It's interesting. Training as a historian, philosopher of biology, I'm not supposed to think about either. But with that said, there was a real kind of emphasis in biological thought where you don't think about form, you think about function.
Of course.
Right? So both of these are kind of small little excursion outside of the zone of where my discipline wants to go. And I want to take it because I think that particular linkage itself is very powerful.
Which linkage?
The linkage between what is an aesthetics and how it pertains to a specific type of politics.
The two types of judgment in Kant that you refer to.
That's exactly right. The
Yeah.
aesthetic judgment and
Yeah.
the biological, natural history judgment.
Right. Tell us a little bit more about those two types of judgments and what you were trying to say.
Well, this comes from Kant's third critique, which for me is the most interesting critique, and he does something that's actually quite remarkable and that you may not find in other ways of thinking about biology today. But I still found, despite the fact that I'm not a big fan of Kant, but I still find productive his trying to think through these issues. And this is what is a judgment, right? As opposed to actually knowing reasonable, what is it opposed to having a judgment instead of having reason? And one of the things he comes up with is that a judgment already has within it some idea that there's some type of pattern or direction
Sure.
that's going to be happening, which is often thought of in terms of what philosophers would call purposiveness. But for him, there's a big distinction between the purposiveness of art versus that of science, because he says in science, in biology specifically, in natural history, is you see an end in what he would usually call, for aesthetics, purposelessness.
Purposelessness, yes,
Yeah.
yes. But some
Purposeful.
kind of intuition of a larger order.
That's right. And
Yeah.
sometimes, if we were, again, appealing to cybernetic thinking, we might even think about it as pattern formation. Right?
Yeah, sure.
And discerning a notion of pattern formation there. But with biology, the very idea of the means of how things are organized, organisms are organized,
Yeah.
provides the end itself.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so there's this real kind of tight working together of form and function that you get with Kant that I just find really fascinating. Although in my paper, one of the ways of thinking about what I argue in my paper is that maybe we should be thinking about life more like Kant's theory of beauty as not having, as seeing a purposiveness there, but not having an ultimate end.
You refer to the German Romantics and sort of critique the German idealism, romanticism, and so on. But there's also, at the late 18th, early 19th centuries, also the era of the Gothic, and the sort of the rise of the Gothic, and the sort of and this idea of, which I think you refer to also in your paper, the Gothic as the making simultaneous exactly the things that should not be simultaneous.
That's exactly
So
right.
Frankenstein's a classic example, or you have a series of things that shouldn't come together, the combination of the synthesizer and the harp, and things like that.
Yes, that's right. And the notion of life and death itself.
Life and
being
death
held
itself
together.
coming together.
Yeah, yeah.
And that shouldn't, that for the Walking Dead, the
That's right. We too
zombie
often-
genre.
We too often in our life want to put strict lines. It's like, I was just telling my students, it's like taking the veil between what is living and what is dead. And we try so hard to make sure that that veil stays there.
Yeah, of course.
But there's an incredible amount of value of actually being able to carry both of those things with you together. And not only just in the banal way that death shapes life, but to actually think about what does it mean to not synthesize something into a higher goal or a higher function.
Right.
What does it mean to develop an aesthetics of life where those two things are held together simultaneously?
Yes, yes.
Where you don't fall into progressivism or you don't fall into nihilism.
Right. I mean, it's always struck me in Hindu mythology, Shiva, I don't know, there's the Trinity. Brahma is the creator, Vishnu is the lawgiver, and Shiva, who dances and runs life, is considered to be the destroyer.
Yeah.
And he's the god of death. So there's the sort of the Gothic characteristics. But it also seems to be connected to the ideas of the carnivalesque, does it not? Bhakti and this whole world.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right as well. I mean, there's this idea of where in life do we find death? And often, and this actually kind of comes out of George Bataille, right?
Sure.
It comes out of the celebrations of the excessiveness of life. You
Yes.
find both sex and death.
Sex and death. Sex and death are closely related.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's one of the places that we find it. And the other place that I found it then was in the post-punk goth era.
Now, what is the post-punk goth era? Enlighten us.
Yes, so there was this period in popular music, and unfortunately, I was never enlightened enough to actually listen to it then. It's like most things in life that are interesting. I come to them 30 years later. And there's this period of time, right? The musicians are kind of toying with this aesthetic of what does it mean to embrace darkness,
Mm-hmm.
right? And most recently, I think we've been toying with that aesthetic as well.
Most recently, we have been what?
Toying with that aesthetic as
Do
well.
you think it's coming back?
Oh, yeah.
Really?
How do we embrace darkness? Yeah. I think you see an increase of this in some of the critical philosophy,
Uh-huh.
where there's an increased role in people talking about nihilism once again.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
I think you see this in personal reflections of how we all are trying to wrestle with our experiences of what we went through during the pandemic
Oh, sure.
and a lot of the losses that we experienced.
Yeah, that's interesting to think of the pandemic as the sort of reminder of death.
Yes, the dance of the 21st century dance with death.
Yeah, yeah. Now, but let's go back to the 70s, the post-punk. What is post, and what are we posting?
So the punks are often known for nihilism,
Right.
and in the sense of embracing a total notion of anarchy.
Yeah.
And
Are you thinking Clockwork Orange here, or what are you thinking?
you're thinking Clockwork Orange, I'm thinking the Clash, I'm thinking the Sex Pistols.
Oh, Sex Pistols. All right.
Yeah, yeah.
Now you're talking my language, because now we're connected to fashion, because that walks straight. That's Vivienne Westwood. And
Absolutely.
goes straight to Alexander McQueen.
That's right.
Yeah.
And this is kind of one of the duplicitous kind of things that the punks do at the time, because they're saying, they developed this notion of fashion based on this idea of nihilism, that they don't care about the world.
Yeah, I have read that as a finger up to the world.
Yeah.
But you're right. It's finger up with their backs against the darkness of life,
That's right. That's
rather
right.
than an alternative utopia.
That's right. And some of the people then end up kind of exploring that in the music a little bit more deeply. That what does it mean to actually not just embrace purposelessness, but to actually kind of create an aesthetics of both light and dark, of combinations, right?
Yeah.
Of different aspects of bringing together aspects of human experience that you usually wouldn't find. And so part of what you see happening here at this particular time is you start seeing the use of synthesizers, right? With, certain other forms of embracing synthesizers, as well as even more traditional instruments. You see this even in what would be called the goth resurgence today in music. As there's so much now, there's kind of a revival of organ music in popular music.
Do you associate organ with brightness and light? Yes, because it's church stuff, or is it darkness?
See, that's the beautiful thing about the organ, is it is both. It
Yeah.
is both the brightness and light, and it shows how the church and our different ways we have of thinking about life and our place in the cosmos embraces both of them. Because the organ is also the dirge,
The dirge. Oh yeah, the funeral dirge.
the funeral
Yes.
dirge. And
Yes.
this ends up becoming one of the structuring elements for a lot of the music.
Yeah, you're
That
right,
comes out
and
of
it's
the
like it's also like revelation and
It's drama.
it's drama.
Yeah.
Yeah, you use the word drama several times in here.
Yes, and this is kind of my swipe at some evolutionary theory, which wants to smooth life out into neat systems and success stories.
What does drama mean to you? What does the word drama mean?
Drama means what occurs when things remain not necessarily in conflict, but don't remain resolved.
Aha, unresolved.
And this ends up becoming something. I think it ends up becoming something we're hungry for.
Yeah.
Because it shows us how we can exist in the world more fully by kind of embracing some of the things that aren't easily put together in a progressivist, productive life.
Yeah. That's interesting. Conventionally, architecture prides itself as solution making. In other words, resolution.
Yeah.
But certainly, I would argue, and in my upcoming book on rethinking Le Corbusier's work in Chandigarh, where I'm from,
Oh, yeah.
I articulate and offer the project as unresolved.
Oh, that's fantastic.
So incomplete is my word over there. But I think unresolved is better. But I try and articulate it as incomplete by design, not that it can be completed, because there's a whole discussion about how to complete it.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yes.
And the other phrase that my colleague Mark Jasenbeck and I in our conceptual practice embrace is uncertainty.
Yeah.
Uncertainty not as the prelude to certainty, but as the nature of certainty in one sense.
That's right. Yeah.
Would you describe all this as being Gothic?
Oh, yes. The reason why the Gothic and the Goth end up becoming important for me, though, is because of the conversations I'm engaging with in biology. A lot of people locate the origins of biology in German Romanticism.
In German Romanticism?
Right.
Yeah.
And trying to understand kind of a revolt away from the rationalism
Right.
of the natural sciences. And
Biology is located in Romanticism?
yes. This is why we get development. This is why we get nature studies,
I see.
right? So it's an embrace of the natural.
Okay.
But for me, that plays too much in a very romantic conception on how things are organized as literally taking the idea of organize and turning it into the idea of organism.
Oh, organized becomes organism.
Right.
Wow. Is that a productive etymology that you have created, or is that
No, it's part of the
It's part
history
of the
of
history.
thinking. Yeah. And then also in biological systems. So what do organisms have? They have organs.
Organs. Oh my God.
Yeah.
organs, organized, organization.
We are so
Because we have to be organized.
That's
because we are made in the image of God, even though we have given God up.
That's right. And so I'm interested
And nature is organized.
Bingo.
I mean, this is such a huge fiction. I am so. I get upset when people, sort of say, well, Earth is perfect. I think it is much better if we understand that Earth is a very fragile, barely put together entity,
Right.
which could easily come apart.
Right.
And then we might be a bit more aware of ecology and
Absolutely.
climate, rather than think, the Earth has been around for 4 billion years, nothing's going to happen, what the shit are we going to do?
And it's that state then of being aware that the world isn't organized perfectly, that I would call goth. It's the play of light and shadows,
Yeah.
and that we live in. And in terms of biology, I mean, so much about biology, evolutionary theory, for instance, we always talk about the winners. We talk about the adaptations.
Right.
We don't talk about the goth organisms that haven't adapted, that are embracing life and death.
Yes,
we
yes,
talk
yes.
about the heroes.
We talk about the quote-unquote heroes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I thought you were going to say, when I asked you why you were into the Gothic, that you were going to tell me that in the 1970s you were part of a goth band.
I knew you were thinking that. I wasn't cool enough to do anything like that.
I see. Okay, you weren't part of a goth band, but you must have. I feel you have a Gothic personality.
Yes, I do. And I grew up after the punk era, and
In the sad 80s under Ronald Reagan.
yeah, that's right. And I embrace more glam than goth
Okay.
at the time.
I see.
And but at the same
Glam is who? The Bangles or what?
No, that would just think about David Bowie.
David Bowie.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
And but it's actually watching my daughter grow up, me watching how careers develop. We're sold so many promises in life,
Yeah.
right? About this is what it means to accomplish something, and
Right.
I can accomplish things,
Sure.
but that's not all that I do.
Yeah.
I like drama. I like.
You like drama.
I mean, I like appreciating the capacity for life itself to hold different things together, right? I like appreciating the fact that, oh yeah, I can accomplish things, but at the same time, I can feel horrible on one
Yeah.
day.
And at the same time.
And at the same time, right?
And that's okay.
And that's okay, right? And this is something.
There's this whole, medical industry about let's not have you feel bad.
Yes. And there's this wellness industry
Yeah.
where we don't concentrate on bad feelings.
Yeah.
There's a health industry,
Yeah.
right, where we don't even think about death.
Yeah.
We think about life extension.
Yeah. And there's the whole architecture industry. Let's just make everything pretty stable and keep the rain out.
Yes, absolutely. That's a really
We're not
great-
going to make buildings to make you feel uncomfortable and a bit sad.
Yeah. It's really kind of a shifting of a viewpoint, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And understanding that there's a value to that, right? It doesn't make the other stuff disappear,
No.
right? Because you'll always have your progressivists or your happy people pointing out that, well, look at this works,
Yeah.
right? Because it does. It's
Yeah.
self-justifying. But at the same time, it's also important to point out if you shift your perspective here, your world becomes larger, and you can see that what is a self-justifying conclusion to you ends up becoming one of many possible stories.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in those many possible stories.
Right. How would you integrate in the sort of calculus sense this interest in the many possible stories and the contradictions and the comfortableness with discomfort and horror and dread? as, how would you integrate this into a general philosophy of life?
Right.
What is your perspective on the purpose of life?
Okay. You ask hard questions. So this is the beautiful thing about, I think, of kind of embracing this type of goth aesthetic in relationship to life is, I don't think I could describe a purpose as an achievement
Yeah.
or a function,
Yeah.
but I can describe it as a feeling and as an aesthetic.
Mm-hmm.
I can talk about how darkness and light come together. I can talk about how the hardness of bone and the softness of flesh
Yeah.
come together. I can talk about how we live in multiple times
Yeah.
at the same time.
Right.
This, for me, is the part about life that I get excited about. I'm not exactly sure if there's a purpose, but I do know that I'm sensitive.
Mm-hmm.
I do know I register the world.
You do register the world.
Yeah.
That's beautifully put. That's beautifully put. Yeah, I think I agree with you. I mean, it's a truly debilitating, in a sense, Abrahamic inheritance, coupled with a sort of a Lacanian reading of desire, which
Yes.
is also a kind of a Catholic reading of the production of
Absolutely.
identity.
Yes, yes.
That we are haunted by the idea of purpose, destiny, and eventual judgment. That is demonstrably fictitious.
Right.
Whereas the apprehension that you have a sensitivity,
Yes.
the awareness that you can be engaged by and engage the world, the knowledge that you can be frightened and aroused and in the thrall of the aesthetic and the beautiful and the grotesque is undeniable.
Yes, absolutely. And not only is it undeniable, I mean, there's actually kind of an interesting theory of time in relationship to experience there.
Mhm.
It is those moments that when we are sensitive to the world and that we're open to the world and often excited or in pain, that's not so much a purpose, but there's a shape to it. There's an unfurling to it that can kind of happen.
Mhm.
And I think that in and of itself, for me, is a way to think about life and the tensions that are inherent in life and how that creates
Mhm.
an aesthetic.
Mhm. Mhm. So aesthetics over purpose.
Yes. Thinking in terms of aesthetics.
Very Bataille.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Very much Bataille. It's also it changes if you kind of embrace a notion of Bataille and the idea of excess.
Excess?
Yeah, in relationship to scientific theories itself, it changes how you look at natural selection. In the history of natural selection, it's always been about selection. It's always been about I select things based on their purpose and how they adapt.
But nature is full of excess.
But nature is full of excess, and that changes how we think about the world, where you start embracing variance and variation
Yeah.
instead of purpose.
I mean, I look at the whole sort of architecture of the universe. Let's say if one of its purposes is to create life on Earth. Oh my God, what a lot of ridiculous design to have the Big Bang. And all these stars and all these distances and all these black holes and then this one star and then 8 useless planets and then like, holy cow.
It's all just kind of patched together.
Barely, and it's like excessive
barely.
to ultimus, I mean, the excess is everywhere. But even down to the Bataille example, ever since I've read Bataille, I can't walk past a flower without just looking at its exquisite detail and performance.
Yes.
And that's not for that stupid honeybee, because the honeybee is going by the
That's exactly right.
pheromones, and
Yeah.
what the shit is the flower doing? It's
I know. I love that question. And for me, it kind of comes out in listening to bird song.
yeah, there you go.
And, you're going to talk to behavioralists or say, well, that's about attracting a mate, or that's about marking territory.
Oh, yeah.
Right? No.
No.
Birds are goth, and they're just singing, and they're waiting to hear what comes back.
Can we quote you on this? Birds are goth.
Yeah.
Yes, birds are goth, and they're just singing.
Yeah.
So this is to be differentiated from poetics, is it?
Yeah, and in my earlier work, I was talking a lot about poetics, and
Yeah.
there are certain ways of thinking about poetics that fit very well with this.
Yeah.
The issue with poetics, though, is that it's in the written register. It's in linguistics still.
Only?
No,
Yeah.
no, not at all. Not only. But the nice thing about the Goth is that it's really hard to locate it. It moves all around. It's in architecture. It's in literature.
And the problem with poeses and poetics is that there is a distinct sense of sublimation.
Right.
I mean, that this all, in a sense, has a purpose,
Yes, absolutely.
which is kind of uplifting the human spirit or some shit like that.
Yeah.
Whereas the Gothic does not do that.
No. The Gothic is not about the creation.
And it leaves things unresolved.
Yeah.
That beautiful song by The Cure that you described, which was, I think, the score of a film. What was it? Begins with a long introduction before
Right.
before the lyrics come in.
And you get a whole set of rhythmic innovations, and they kind of evoke a sense of timelessness, right?
Yeah.
And this in itself is kind of fascinating, because it's how do we hold something that's timeless and something like a pop song?
Yes. Well, it's kind of a pop song, but
I think it's called Other Voices.
Other Voices, yes. Other Voices. You analyze Other Voices from The Cure's 1981 album Faith, and you say it begins by featuring the rhythm section of the band with a strong resonant bass line and drumming that lacks fills, rolls, snares, or the use of cymbals. Nothing happens. It doesn't seem to be leading to anywhere.
It's just marking time.
When the guitar is added, it plays mostly ringing textures, creating a series of whirling motifs carefully layered over the rhythm. The overall effect of the song's introduction is drone-like, lending it a sense of timelessness. I must disagree with you with the use of the word timelessness,
Yeah.
but I think what you're saying, I understand.
Yes.
Because for me, timelessness has this connotations of eternity and sort of
Right.
magical sublimation, which, anyway, I don't think that's what you mean.
No, it's not. I
Or
appreciate
what you
that.
mean is not, it doesn't have a teleology to it.
It's a longer sense of duration.
Yeah. Feeling of timelessness is further heightened by having a very long instrumental introduction, a compositional device frequently used in other Cure songs from the period, where some introductions take up half of the song length. When Robert Smith's vocals are introduced, they begin with a shriek before settling into the song lyric as sung through the echo box. That description stayed with me. I had never heard of this song, so I played it in my car driving up here today.
Good.
There's a kind of existential quality to your description.
Yes. there is.
Feels a bit Albert Camus.
Yeah. No, it is, and that's the thing that that's another aspect of talking about the Goth that I like, is it ties this existential idea
Uh-huh.
into what could often be considered a very abstract category, like aesthetics.
Mm-hmm.
And the Goth is part of the reason why the Goth is shifting up perspective, is it's about embracing lived experience, right? It's about finding the different stories,
Yeah.
and how we have to hold things together that rationally don't often make sense,
Yeah.
right? And that's an existential issue.
It is an existential issue. I want you to try and distinguish what you're talking about as the Goth, as differentiated from hedonism, because often enough the purposeless life is replaced by the idea of accessing unbridled pleasure, or some definition
Yes.
of that.
Yes. That's right.
This is something else.
Yes, it is very much something else, because, first of all, it's not a specific replacement.
Mm-hmm.
The interesting thing about the Goth itself is that it's not just a full return into hedonism, although it recognizes a certain experience of life itself.
Mm-hmm.
It's how do we then hold together our experience of life with the fact that we're always in this place where we're trying to make sense of things still as we go through life.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And so it's a much harder thing to wrestle with,
Yeah.
right? Because you're actually having to wrestle with things that aren't reconciled. You have to hold those together. Whereas hedonism is purely kind of a letting go.
Yeah. Letting go, and again, a search for utopia.
And it's utopian.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's exactly right. And in terms of biology, again, I mean, when most people say, well, aren't you doing just the romantic thing about embracing nature and embracing death? And I was saying, yeah, but the problem with the romantics is they still had purpose.
Yeah.
So it looks a lot like it,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it's also this sense of identifying, replacing the notion of having an overarching purpose with the importance of being able to be sensitive and register the occurrences in the world,
Yeah.
and acknowledging them and carry them with you.
Yeah. I think that's a great manifesto for architecture. Of course, I shouldn't be using the word manifesto. Manifesto is already purposeful.
Which makes me wonder what a Goth manifesto might look like.
Well, in a sense, I'm reading your article as a Goth manifesto.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense.
I mean, because I think you're right. You don't want to completely sidestep the question of purpose of manifesto.
That's right.
You're not saying that it's non-existent or irrelevant to the human experience.
Right.
It's not the phallus. It's not the master.
That's
quote.
right.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
In that sense, I would argue this in some way. This is a feminist reading in
Right.
the 80s, 90s sense. You know, the sex which is not one Lucy Rigret or
Absolutely.
Julia Kristeva's Jouissance.
Yeah, and it's also kind of a disability studies reading as well.
Yeah.
Right, because there's an idea of a frank recognition of the variation within bodies.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think Alexander McQueen, as a fashion designer, coming out of what you're calling the post-punk, the Sex Pistols in the 1970s London and 1980s London, the anti-Reagan London, anti-Thatcher London, he developed an aesthetic completely out of that. And if you look at his work, he always refused to produce an alternate beauty, you know.
Oh, that's fascinating.
He was always presenting life pretty grittily.
Yeah.
Particularly the idea of woman, very grittily.
Mm.
He always said he wanted to present the powerful woman.
Mm.
But he never presented the powerful woman as Marvel woman.
Right.
It was always through the very disturbing woman fears, like rape, for instance.
Right.
And he got, skewered for doing that.
Right.
But it was always about, he kept saying, I'm presenting the strong woman. But it wasn't the strong woman which was it was a fiction, but a more abject, in the Kristeva sense, presentation of the figure.
Well, this is the very focus. You use the word fear here, and I think that's a very important Goth word.
Yeah, fear, yes.
Because fear, for me, is very much about that dynamic of having something, a pattern in the world, a way we have of looking at the world, and yet realizing that it is insufficient.
Yeah.
And my example for this often is the haunted house, the big
I see.
Gothic symbol.
Yeah.
And in the haunted house, we actually have two incompatible logics
Right,
happening.
right.
One of them is the domestic logic that makes us feel very comfortable and we're at home.
Yeah.
And the other one is this supernatural logic.
Yeah.
And the fact that they don't couple well
Yeah.
brings fear.
Yeah. But that's the uncanny. Unheimlich in Freud.
Yeah, it is. But the thing that kind of, I think, goes beyond that is not just the uncanny, because that's very much about a personal feeling.
Mm-hmm.
It's really about a way now that once you have this aesthetic, it's really now about a way of how we hold together time and space, all time and space. It's not just located in specific moments. We learn from those moments to think about, you know what? All space is heterogeneous.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just these moments.
Yeah.
There are special things about all moments,
Yeah.
right? But at the same time, it's this idea that all moments have potential and can't be homogenized.
I see. So you're saying the uncanny is in Freud or Freudian derivative readings a sort of a specialness which is to be produced by a resplendent aesthetic experience,
Right.
whereas if you, through your reading via the Gothic, this is actually a descriptor of the common condition of life.
Yes. That was really elegant. Thank you.
And I agree with that. I think for me this is a kind of eros. And in Freud, eros is always purposed against civilization. Civilization
Yes.
and its discontents and so on and so forth. Whereas eros in this Gothic sense can be the whole descriptor of life.
That's right. That's exactly right.
And I think that that's powerful.
Yes.
And it's would be amazing, I'm going to say, admonishment to thinking about architecture.
Yeah.
To do architecture as if you were leading a Gothic life.
Yes.
Which you are, you're just not allowing yourself to.
Yeah, we have never learned to embrace our inner goth.
Our inner God. So you're saying we all have an inner God.
Oh yeah. It is that which we tend to ignore, right? It is that which, if we recognized it, we would have to problematize our easy divisions between light and dark, life and death.
At one point in your paper, you do argue, however, that Goth only works as a counter proposition to the normative or the normal in the everyday. If everybody embraced the inner Goth, would it be inner Goth?
Yeah, no, this is actually, I think, one of the most beautiful things about thinking about the Goth in terms of subculture that comes out of it is that nobody wants to be Goth. They embrace being Goth, but at the same time, it ends up becoming a statement for them in a way that only makes sense because everybody else is out there trying to achieve. And that's important. We're not trying to create a new solution, right? We're just trying to figure out ways of looking at the world that can help us see new and different things.
Yeah, but let's rest for a moment there. I mean, it feels to me like we are back with Foucault's heterotopias, which require the normative, just as much as the normative requires the heterotopia. The asylums and the prisons and the hospitals, Foucault argues, are necessary for producing the normative, but that also, therefore, the heterotopias need the normative. But perhaps that's not quite so yin-yang.
Yes, it's the word necessary there. I don't think the word necessary in and of itself suggests a type of outcome. Right? And I think the outcome itself is the drama that's produced. the friction between the two,
I see.
and not one or the other.
Right.
It's still kind of a choice.
But you would rather definitely see more on the Gothic heterotopic side than on the normative
Oh,
side.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Absolutely. But it's important. Later in the history of Goth music, Goth becomes a cliche in a sense, because it becomes about
Later, you mean like 90s, 2000s, or what do you
yeah,
mean?
90s and 2000s. Some strands of Goth end up becoming about a performativity of a certain way of thinking about death and horror.
Yeah.
But that's not what keeps this fresh. Right? What keeps this fresh is recognizing the very powerful way of thinking about how holding two incommensurable things together.
Mm-hmm.
That's what keeps it fresh. So the Goth is going to change, right? As soon as you resolve it into a specific type of aesthetic, you either now have life or death.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, petit mort in French, it's just this contradiction held in place.
Yeah, yeah.
But you end the article by, it seems to me, by a discussion on cancer.
Yes, that's exactly right.
And cancer as a kind of Goth biology.
That's right. This is actually the most controversial part of this article.
Yeah, for sure.
Because we too often think about cancer. I mean, it's true with how we think about health in general. We think about all health as eradicating disease.
Right.
And that's a goal we've never achieved.
It's impossible to achieve.
It's impossible. It's idealism.
Yeah.
So what's kind of interesting, though, is it goes back to research in the 70s and 80s about how we produce cancerous tissue within us,
Mm-hmm.
right? That comes about through an inherent tension in the body itself, a tension between the body's wanting to organize versus the body's wanting to proliferate in its cells. And so
And the body wanting to die, in a concept.
in the body wanting to die because of that proliferation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it turns out that cancer isn't just a response to a challenging environment by perfectly organized beings.
Uh-huh.
Cancer ends up, it's a part of us. It's the very looseness of how we have that's being formed
Yeah.
within us. And that doesn't mean that we don't try to treat cancer, we don't learn to live with it, but it does suggest different ways we have of thinking about what it means to be cured. Is being cured returning to a naive state,
Mm-hmm.
right? An ideal state?
Yeah.
A state before a scar could be formed?
Yeah.
I don't think so. I think I've been thinking about being cured right now a little bit like, have you seen those pictures of objects that are embedded in trees? Like you hammer a nail into a tree,
Okay.
and the tree doesn't return to its pre-nail state. It builds bark up around it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it holds both the nail and the growth afterwards together.
Scar tissue.
It's like a scar tissue, but it's also kind of a recognition of that which causes the scar.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So you're calling building scars curing.
I'm calling building scars enduring. And it is the embodiment of what it means to be sensitive, right? And not have to feel heroic.
Mm-hmm. So what is your reading of the purpose of trauma and the whole sort of psychotherapy around trauma?
Well, I'm not sure if there is a purpose to trauma, but there is a feeling to trauma. And I don't think that we actually ever, there is no pre-traumatic or post-traumatic state. It's there. Trauma is inherent. And this comes back to actually, even in some of the psychological literature, I've been reading the psychotherapist Sander Ferenczi, and this notion about the biological unconscious,
Oh.
and this idea that trauma itself is kind of built into the evolutionary history of all animals. And it comes in, it is something we take with us, is the fact that our bodies are not perfectly, I mean, part of our body was adapted to be in the water.
Yeah.
And we're not often perfectly suited to be on land.
Yeah.
Trauma is there. Trauma is a part of what we are and how we exist.
Yeah. 5 major extinctions on planet Earth.
Exactly.
Write trauma into that long evolutionary process.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Phil, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Always. Always. Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it tremendously.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Mary Lee. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.